My name is Elizabeth McNally, and I'm from Northwestern University. And this is a session on the intersection between the academic role in basic science and industry. And so I'm joined today by my colleagues Deepak Srivastava, Carolyn Ho, Farah Sheikh, Doug Hetrick, and we will be talking to you today about some of our different experiences across the spectrum of working with industry from both the academic side and the industry side. And I will start by telling you some of my experiences first, and then we'll go through the panel and you'll get to hear from each person and what their experience has been. And then the second half of this, we will open up for questions because we're sure lots of people have questions how this process works. So as I said, my name is Elizabeth McNally. I am a cardiologist, so I'm an active physician, and I'm also a scientist, and I spend most of my time doing research. I'm at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine in Chicago, and I also lead our cardiovascular genetics clinical program at the Bloom Cardiovascular Institute. I spend the majority of my time in basic translational research. Much of our work has been on identifying genetic pathways that lead to cardiovascular phenotypes, with focus on heart failure and cardiomyopathies. I've also had a long parallel interest studying neuromuscular diseases like muscular dystrophies because of their overlap with cardiomyopathies. And I actually have gained a lot of experience working on that neuromuscular side, watching some of the genetic therapies actually move to become a reality and become a real treatment for patients. The neuromuscular field has really seen a lot of these genetically motivated therapies develop over, I would say, about a 10 to 20 year period, with some drug approvals over the last 5 years. So we now know in the neuromuscular field, we have multiple different exon antisense mediated exon skipping therapies that are approved for treating both Duchenne muscular dystrophy as well as spinal muscular atrophy. We're also seeing a marked uptick in gene therapy in the neuromuscular disease space, where we've seen drugs approved for spinal muscular atrophy and multiple ongoing trials right now for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And this just reflects that the genetic tools are rapidly expanding in many different ways. We're seeing new chemistries come along every day for exon skipping, and most of these, again, are being done on the industry side. We're also seeing from the gene therapy perspective, improved vectors that have better tissue tropism, which is critically important as we think about viral gene therapy. But I think the thing that many of us in the genetics space are especially excited about is watching everything happening with gene editing. And pretty much day by day, we're seeing new possibilities come forward with that. The interest that I've seen has been from both biotech, small startups, in between startups, and of course established pharmaceutical companies. And there are now actually, major pharmaceutical companies that have rare disease units, because most of everything I've been talking about as a genetically motivated strategy has really been what's conventionally been considered rare diseases. There was a switch a number of years back that basically, through a lot of programs, regulatory possibilities, that basically made it much more viable to take therapies forward for rare diseases. And that's why we've seen this big shift in the last 10 years or so. How did I get experiences working with companies? Well, my main experience is really developed because I had two organizations that I worked with where we would frequently review early phase programs, mainly coming from industry, but sometimes also coming from academia. And again, looking to the neuromuscular space, many years ago, we had recognized that there just wasn't good organization of the patient groups and the natural history studies, which we'll hear about a little bit more. And so through a variety of organizations, there was a coalescence of something called the Treat NMD group, which was a multinational organization to try to put together data on neuromuscular patients. That begat another program, which was called TACT, which is the Treat NMD Advisory Committee for Therapeutics. And these are a review panel that puts together from academics, from industry, from the regulatory side, both the EMA and the FDA, and can allow a program to be reviewed fully by a number of 25 people at the same time in a room. And so I got to see a lot of early phase programs doing it, made a lot of connections with industry doing those types of reviews, and sometimes then would consult on my own to some of those programs. I've also worked extensively with the Muscular Dystrophy Association. They have a venture philanthropy fund, which again can fund early phase programs coming from industry or academia. But it was basically through these reviewing processes that I got to learn about a lot of different programs happening. In my own research, we've been actually pursuing what are genetic therapies focused on genetic modifiers. We've identified signals using animal models and then taken some of this forward. Sorry about that, taken some of this forward in the forms of two different protein therapeutic programs that we're doing. One has been funded through NIH and DoD. There is actually ways to get funding through federal sources for some of these things. And then a second program that we have here at Northwestern is through more of an incubator space that Northwestern has partnered with a venture firm called Deerfield Investments. And so we've been able to advance a program through that. And so through that, we've gained a lot of experience. So basically my experiences have been working through the review process to learn about a lot of different companies and programs. And I now consult for a number of those companies and programs. And then through our own research, advancing two programs forward. And so with that, I think I'm gonna pause and jump off to Deepak. I don't know if you wanna go next. Good to see you this morning.
Good morning. Good to see you also. I think we were scheduled for me to go last, which would be fine.
Sure, we can go in whatever order. It's all good.
Schedule, and as we're moderating, and maybe
yes, but we'll have Carolyn go. We'll have Carolyn go next. Okay, very good.
Great. Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this really interesting and forward-looking session. I'm Carolyn Ho. I'm the medical director of the Cardiovascular Genetics Center at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and I'm a clinical investigator. I'm a cardiologist interested in genetics, and I've been interested in studying genetic cardiomyopathies to try to better understand genotype-phenotype correlations, early phenotypic manifestations of sarcomeric mutations, looking at the transition to disease, when people actually start to manifest overt disease on the background of carrying a disease-causing variant, and looking at drivers of prognosis. Why do some individuals do so poorly and some individuals do so well with seemingly the same genetic background? So over the past, almost 10 years, I've been fortunate to have had a remarkably productive and enjoyable collaboration with industry. Recognizing the need to learn more about the natural history of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a relatively rare genetic cardiomyopathy, MyoKardia provided unrestricted funds to support the creation and maintenance of a large-scale multi-center patient registry. This started when MyoKardia was first founded in 2012. And so this was a small startup company that was interested in applying advances in knowledge about sarcomeric biology to try to identify and institute new disease-specific therapies for genetic cardiomyopathies. And a major limitation was the fact that we really had very little understanding of the natural history of hypertrophic cardiomyopathies or other genetic cardiomyopathies. Largely because there have been no longitudinal, adequately powered cohorts studied. So they decided that they would invest in this and provided unrestricted funding to create such a registry. So about 12 different HCM and cardiovascular genetic specialty centers around the world came together, and we agreed to harmonize and centralize our institutional databases to create SHARE, the Sarcomeric Human Cardiomyopathy Registry. And so this started with about 5,000 HCM patients, and it now includes over 9,000. And this is something that would have been difficult, if not impossible, to establish without the support of industry, because federal funding really has not been, earmarked for this type of science. So MyoKardia provided funding and collaborated in strategic planning, but the investigative mission has been driven entirely by the academic cardiologists that make up the registry. And so over the past 4 years, we've published or contributed to about a dozen different publications. These studies have helped us to better characterize the cumulative burden of disease over a lifetime and identify that patients diagnosed at the youngest age and with disease caused by sarcomeric variants have the worst outcomes in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. We've also been able to study specific subgroups of disease, including the experience of females versus males, of Black patients versus white patients in the US, and also studying a rare subgroup with left ventricular systolic dysfunction. We've looked at the impact of comorbidities, including obesity and hypertension. And we've also been able to study practice differences, specifically looking at ICD utilization in the US versus rest of the world. Identified that patients in the US are over 2 times as likely to receive primary prevention ICDs, despite controlling for comorbidities and the standard risk factors. Despite this practice and looking at patients in the US versus the rest of the world that did not receive an ICD, outcomes were relatively similar, specifically looking at sudden death and cardiac arrest. And so this model has been amazingly successful and enjoyable and productive. And we're now trying to establish other industry partnerships to expand to other phenotypes like dilated and arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathies, and to increase the scope of our science, establishing a biobank and an image repository. And to, again, help further advance these goals and make it a truly academic endeavor, we're in the process of taking over the administration of the registry at the Brigham, functioning as a clinical coordinating center and also a data coordinating center.
So I'll go next, right? Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Farah Sheikh. I'm a professor in the Department of Medicine at UC San Diego. So I have quite a different story. I'm a basic scientist coming into this field, fairly new, but a lot has happened that feel like I've gotten a lot of experiences with industry within a very short time. So my area is also sort of intersects with Elizabeth McNally's area as well, which is genetic-based cardiomyopathy, and also Carolyn's area. But I work more in the area of arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy. And so I've been a hardcore molecular cell biologist, did my PhD in physiology. And when I was studying these proteins, I sort of got to the cell-cell junction. So I was a cytoskeletal person. And as I was studying these proteins, someone in my life actually got diagnosed with ARVC. So it was a very serendipitous sort of, coincidence. And so, given that many of these therapies, unless, you patent something or you find something for them, they don't necessarily go forward. I had that in mind and, studied the disease from a model standpoint because there were very limited models. So we made a lot of genetic mouse models. We've also worked in the iPS-derived cardiomyocyte field to better understand the disease. And it wasn't until I found something very unusual to what I, had been studying. I have a sort of a therapeutic effect that I then patented my findings, or sort of the provisional patent in 2017. And then I think, you're always in this conundrum after a year, almost a year of having the provisional, what are you gonna do? So I think the good thing is that at least UC San Diego is very entrepreneur forward, and they were putting us a lot on these panels to help bolster, to better understand how we could, take our findings forward, in other words. So, I had venture capital, patent lawyers, all these kinds of people that are in industry coming forward, to just, you can pitch your work and, they can give you ideas of what their thoughts were. And for the most part, they were positive. And so I was also connected with an entrepreneur in residence, which UC San Diego retained in order to also help entrepreneurs, which is a good kind of outside view of how to, work with, moving your findings forward. And so I got to the point where in 2018, I ended up starting my own company. called ARVC Therapeutics. Surprise, surprise by the name. You know, the good news also about the environment is that you see other entrepreneurs in this space. And so within a year, we actually I ended up merging my company with another startup called GenStem Therapeutics, which is more cell-based therapies. So we thought, you know, mine was more directed toward gene-based therapies. And, you know, the idea was, oh, this is going to be more attractive to potentially companies with, platforms that may have both in mind. And so we created Stelios Therapeutics in May 2020. And we started pitching to various companies, pharma, VCs, et cetera. We got quite a few offers and we sold the company in July 2021. And because not all assets were bought, we actually spun out to form another company called Papillon Therapeutics. And so the company that bought us then, I'm working very closely with them, Lexio Therapeutics, to move the findings forward. And, you know, that's sort of my story and sort of where it started from.
Great, thanks. I think Doug, you'll go next.
Hi, thanks. And thanks again for the invitation. So my name is Doug Hetrick. I'm a scientist by training. I'm working for Medtronic currently I'm a senior director of medical education and medical science and education, sort of also known as medical affairs. My background's in biomedical engineering. I've been working for Medtronic for about 22 years in different areas, first as a research scientist and now in a different capacity. And before that, I also worked for 12 years in academia. I was a research assistant professor in anesthesiology at the Medical College of Wisconsin for a short period of time. So I have a little bit of perspective from both sides of the discussion here today. Hopefully that's useful. I guess a couple of things I want to emphasize from Medtronic, I'm very interested in the comments that Dr. Ho and Dr. Sheik were stating earlier. So from the Medtronic standpoint, obviously I'll be coming from the perspective of a much larger company. So we do kind of seek out and work for these industry academic partnerships. Most of that primarily goes through our physician-initiated research program. We call it at Medtronic, we happen to call it an external research program. And so I'm pretty involved in that. And we use that for a number of purposes. So primarily, we use it to scout innovation. So we can use this to conduct, of course, we have our own internal clinical program, but that tends to be focused on more fully developed phase 3 type trials. Now we do obviously do Medtronic sponsored phase 1, phase 2 preclinical research. But another way that we can conduct phase 1 and phase 2 research and preclinical research is through that external research program. So it's a great way to scout new technology. So from an academic standpoint, this is something that you can keep in mind. The procedure is pretty straightforward. You basically just contact us. There's actually a website, and there's a multi-step process. It's not like writing an NIH grant, and I'm speaking for Medtronic, but I assume it's a similar procedure with most of the other big companies. You can come to us with an idea. It doesn't have to be a 42-page grant with a completely itemized budget, but what you can present is a basic idea, and we evaluate that idea internally with a team of stakeholders, not just scientists, but also from a strategic standpoint, to see, number one, does the project make sense from a scientific standpoint, and does it fit strategically? And so those can be two separate things. Just because it always has to be good science, but even if it is good science, it doesn't always fit. But this can be helpful. The other thing we get out of it, besides scouting new technology, it also helps develop our clinical and our preclinical program. But from an academic standpoint, it can also, it's a good way to establish a reputation with industry in terms of your own research capabilities. So from an academic standpoint, if you're not the Mayo Clinic or the Cleveland Clinic, that's okay. But sometimes it helps to create a presence for us, create a relationship, and that can be built into additional collaboration down the line. So from an external research, but it's a really good thing to keep in mind. And I think also to keep in mind, this doesn't necessarily compete. This can be an alternate form of funding for an academic institution. So it's okay. Dr. Ho was talking earlier, really interesting stuff about this industry partnership and the fact that the SHARE project can be funded by multiple industrial partners. It goes the same way with even if we're the sole industry partner, you can still have, for example, NIH or government funding for an ERP. It's also a nice way, if you don't have NIH funding, it's a nice way to maybe establish an additional source of funding. Now industry money tends to, not sound as nice academically, but I do want to point out that when we fund these ERPs, we're not in control. We provide funding and that's it. We don't run the trial. We don't design the protocol. We don't execute the protocol, and we don't own the data, right? We basically what we do is provide grant funding, and so that's critical. I think another thing that Farah was mentioning earlier is besides the external research program, we also, you talked about partnering with industry to develop technology. So again, I know there might be sort of a cringing, from the participants. Well, if I come to, a big company like Medtronic with an idea, are they going to steal my idea? But we do work very closely with clinicians to develop technology, both to develop new innovative technology and also to improve existing technology, especially our own existing technologies. We do this all the time, and it can be a way because developing technology can be expensive. I guess the good news for academia is most academic centers now have developed, and I think, Farah, you maybe even mentioned one. You mentioned some internal things. There are mechanisms in place where from an academic standpoint, where if you view the company as kind of this big thing, that it's not us against them. Ideally, now it can be us working with you. And like I say, I get it. I can get the potential concerns. And the advice I always give when folks come and they say, look, I got an idea, I want to bring it to Medtronic. The first thing always to do, of course, is to protect yourself, to protect your institution. But that's also built into the system now. I think most academic institutions have processes in place. Farah, you were mentioning some of these where you can work to make sure that you're protected, your interests in your ideas and your intellectual property are protected, and then we can work together. It's good to have the resources of a big device company behind you when you're developing new technology. We can do things that aren't feasible with an academic institution perhaps acting alone. And so I think that those are the two main things that I wanted to highlight. And maybe I'll also point out, it was very interesting, Dr. Ho, you were talking about these orphan diseases. Maybe I can give as an example. So right now I'm working in an area known as renal denervation, where we're innovating for, this is a device-based procedure for control of hypertension, where we actually do a percutaneous procedure. You ablate the sympathetic nerves through the renal artery, the sympathetic nerves that are leading to the kidney. And of course, we're focusing on hypertension. We're examining other areas of research like heart failure, perhaps, or arrhythmias. These are all areas that could have potential. But there's another area, loin pain hematuria syndrome. So polycystic kidney disease and loin pain syndromes, where there were at least anecdotes where this technology could help. But this was a very small market, right? So this is something that, as a big company like Medtronic, we wouldn't necessarily have gone to right away. But we did get some interest from academia, and we worked through our ERP program. We're actually funding some or helping supply funding and product to actually some government-sponsored trials in Canada, in particular, where they're looking. These are randomized phase 2-ish trials, looking at the ability of renal denervation to help with these loin pain syndromes. So these studies are ongoing, but this is, I guess, a good example of an area where we can help in these same areas. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion with the group and talking some more about how these different areas can work together.
Great, thank you, Doug. And maybe I'll wrap up with this part of the panel discussion, and we'll get to Q&As that people can enter into the Slido app. So my name is Deepak Srivastava, and I'm trained as a pediatric cardiologist, and I do clinical work at UCSF Children's Hospital. And I am also an investigator at the Gladstone Institutes and serve as president there as well. And our work has spanned issues of cardiogenesis to cardiac genetics to regenerative medicine within my laboratory. And about a decade ago, maybe a little bit more, I had gotten involved with starting a biotech company called Hyperion that was using iPS-based technologies for drug discovery. And that was ultimately, we started that with Kleiner Perkins, and that was ultimately acquired some years ago in 2014, and it's advancing a drug into clinical trials. More recently, however, we had, I thought I'd share with you a model that we developed at the Gladstone Institutes that was a bit unique, and we took advantage of the ecosystem that we have here in the Bay Area with a number of local entrepreneurs and biotech leaders, as well as venture capitalists. And we developed a program we called BioFulcrum at Gladstone, which was, we raised philanthropic dollars for to invest in a team of scientists that would go after some of the big problems, at least in heart disease area, that we thought would be serving as perhaps obstacles to gaining commercial investment in our field. And so this was a team made up of cardiologists like myself, molecular biologists, stem cell biologists, proteomics experts, computational biologists, chemists, and put that team together. And for a couple of years, tried to break down some of those barriers. And we had developed an advisory board made up of many of the leaders in the Bay Area in biotech and venture capital as advisors. And along the way, they saw how we were functioning, what discoveries were being made. And about 2 years into that, David Goodell, who is one of our advisors and the founder of the Column Group, a venture capital firm here in the Bay Area, indicated an interest in putting that into a company and financing that. So we, after looking at a number of VC companies, decided to do that with the Column Group with a $50 million Series A investment they put in to get started on two fronts. One is addressing cardiac regeneration, and the other using iPS cells, again, as a platform for drug discovery for genetically defined disorders. So we launched that in 2016. And I would say one of my lessons from this effort has been all money is not good money. And it's really important to select your partners, venture partners, wisely, and particularly if you're going after difficult problems, which I think in heart disease, almost all our problems are difficult, to choose investors that are really in it for the long haul and are willing to do the difficult things with you and recognize the time that it'll take. And so that's, the Column Group has certainly functioned that way over the last 5 years. And over that period, we've been able to develop gene therapy approaches for reprogramming of resident fibroblasts in the heart into new myocytes as a regenerative medicine approach. We've also leveraged our gene therapy expertise that we've developed extensively in-house, including with manufacturing of adeno-associated viruses for more lock and key types of diseases where one might be missing a protein and wants to replace it. And so there are a couple of programs underway, including a myosin binding protein C effort for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy that Beth McNally is also involved with in Carolyn. And then finally, we have done drug discovery for certain genetically defined forms of heart failure and identified drugs that appear to work not just in human iPS-derived cardiomyocytes, but also in vivo in mice. And those two are getting advanced. And together with those efforts, the company has raised about a total of $250 million through a Series B and a Series C financing over the last few years. And this summer in August had an IPO that raised another $200 million with the valuation of a bit over $1 billion right now. But it's going to take all those dollars to get some of these early targets through initial clinical trials. So it's a very, very expensive effort, and it takes a lot of commitment over time, both scientifically as well as financially, to try to get some of these things across the finish line. But we think it's critically important, and that interface between academia and industry, I think, is essential. I've continued to be involved as a chair of the Scientific Advisory Board and on the board of directors. And I think that that continuing role, if one can do that by staying in academia, I think can be very beneficial for the long-term potential for the companies. So maybe I'll stop there, and maybe we can open this up to some question and answers. And Beth, I believe you and I both might have this ability to see the questions in Slido.
Yeah, I don't see any questions coming in yet, but I thought we could just also start by talking among ourselves, which, what's worked, what hasn't. We have a wealth of different types of experience here, where we've heard about everything from, getting venture funding to grant funded to working with industry to get funding. And so I think I'm sure that some of the questions that people probably have to get started, which is, what's the pluses and minuses of different types of funding that you might have? And I don't know if anybody wants to jump in and start thinking about it. I think one of the things I think about a lot is that, if you work directly with industry, there's a big difference between a grant and a contract. And we heard about that a little bit from Doug. Grants are, especially if it's investigator initiated, you're bringing your ideas to the company. That's a grant. It's not a contract. That's one way of getting your work funded. And a grant means, you put a proposal, you're going to do your best to do what's there, but it's not the same as having a deliverable like a contract is. A contract is you've really promised a certain deliverable, and often you have to reach that milestone even to get paid. And so I think those are two really, really different things. So.
Right, and you're right. Just
comment.
And just to extend that point, Beth. Right, that's exactly true. I probably didn't mention. You can also obviously do contract research with a company, and that'd be a little bit different, right? Then obviously there are that relationship is defined, of course, by the contract. I should mention that when we do the grants as well, nowadays when we of course that grant has a contract as well. There are typically milestones. Associated with that, because it's just the nature of the way we, the way these things work now. So again, that doesn't mean that we dictate the research that is done, but we have to make sure that actual research gets performed when we provide the grant.
And those would be mutually agreed upon milestones.
Absolutely.
So obviously can be tailored to the interest of the investigator as well, where that intersects.
Yeah, I mean, I also feel, I also got Department of Defense funding. So that really helped me sort of decide, I have the time a little bit to work with, not, immediately trying to go for venture money or something like that. I had a way to develop my therapeutic, I guess with the rigor and the time and freedom to be able to do those studies. So I think it's very helpful. I think some people think, oh, I'm just going to pitch it and I'll get money and all of that kind of stuff. It doesn't really happen that fast. You still have to do the, work to fund the studies in the natural, in the natural realms that we have in terms of NIH or DoD or private foundations. So I think that's something that, I was fortunate to have that in order to keep the, I guess, the ability to think through the whole, where is my technology going to go?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges a lot of people have is from that initial discovery to gaining commercial investment, there's often this gap before people want to invest commercially that it sounds like you filled through other means. In California, we've had the luxury of using the California Institute of Regenerative Medicine funds that specifically has funded that gap. And a lot of the work we did that led to Tenaya Therapeutics, which is the company we formed, was funded by CIRM doing, pig, large animal trials that would have been difficult otherwise. I was wondering how you thought about that. You mentioned that some assets in the company was acquired and others you're continuing to pursue. How did you think about that decision to sell those assets versus gaining additional investment to develop those that within your own company?
So this was kind of a big, long up and down road. But I think when at first you always think like the more the better, you feel confident, you've got partners, you've got other heads to think about things. But then I think when you start to pitch things, you realize that, wow, I'm going for cardiac people or I'm going for cell people, there's a lot involved in a company taking on two different technologies with two different platforms and all of that. So it just became increasingly clear as we were going through the process of pitching that, there were some assets, at least in that time frame when we were trying to, pitch them, that there was this clear distinction. And so obviously you have to look to see budgetary, and to be honest, I'm not a business person, like tax wise, all of these kinds of things have to be, what is the company worth? Is it good to split? Is it not? I don't know all those details, but I know those details were involved in whether this was a good decision to split versus, retain. And the other thing is that, the other assets may not get the value if you, do sell it all together. And so I think, we were three different founders with three different ideas. So, you want to give everyone their dues in terms of getting their assets to where they want to go. And so I think it was I think we worked well together. The reason I merged is because they had experience going into humans. I obviously did not. And so for me, it was, I wanted their knowledge and their, how they got to that point. So there were a lot of intricate business-wise decisions that, our CEO at least had to deal with that, communicated to us that, yeah.
So we have one question coming in the chat, which is talking about how you it's from Megan Burke, and it's saying, can you talk about how you first made some of these connections, relationships with other funding sources, especially early in your careers or early in your experiences with these groups outside of academia? And that's a great question, because I think it really wants to take us back a few steps, which is how do you actually get engaged with this in the first place? And so I would say from the academic side, the experience really starts with your ideas, and you take your ideas to your tech transfer office at your institution. So as an academic, you're employed by your university. Your university should have a technology transfer office. And because you work for that university, ideas that you have, you first take to your tech transfer office and you propose those ideas to them. And you're essentially asking them to file a provisional and then ultimately, a patent application based on what your ideas are. So your currency, if you will, when you go to have these conversations with potential funders, is to have a patent, either provisional filed or, next step. And that's really a critical part of it. So as somebody just getting started, your first step is really make sure your tech transfer office knows who you are. And so when you first get started at your institution, that is definitely worth your time to make an appointment, usually have somebody in that office who's assigned to work with you, get to know them, let them know what your ideas are, what you're working on, potential foundations that might be interested in. And I think one of the things you'll hear here is that it is highly dependent on your institution and what their engagement is in working with some of these potential funders. And so that can be very, very different from institution to institution. And of course, we know there's, areas of the country where there is a lot more venture capital investment, but that doesn't mean you can't do it from anywhere. So one of the stories I do like to tell is that when I first got started doing this many years ago at my former institution where I worked, I had taken an idea to them and brought it forward. And I said, look, I think this is a great idea. And to be completely honest, they weren't interested in it. They said, no. They said, that's, yeah, great idea, pat me on the head and whatever. But then I asked them back and, I said, well, then will you release that idea to me? Meaning I can pursue it on my own. And I went through the whole process of they released it to me, and it's actually been a patent I've prosecuted on my own, both nationally as well as internationally, which mind you is expensive to do. But at the same time, that's been the currency. That currency of having that patent application has been sufficient not only to help me get funding in my own laboratory, but ultimately to make connections with venture capital and with potential funders. And so, but it all starts with your ideas, and your ideas, you have to protect your ideas, and hopefully your institution wants to do that. But even if your institution doesn't want to do it, sometimes there's other ways of going forward with that.
Deepak, I had a question for you. To be honest, the VC world is a little bit, it appears very scary to the outside world. And I'm sure you went through a lot of ups and downs with that. I was just curious, because there's always they want information, but you want their, help. And so there's this tug of war a little bit with whether or not they're going to fund you and all of that. How did you navigate through that space when, a lot of people want to start companies and want to go the VC route, but it's just such a black box of trying to understand, and you specifically said it yourself, who are the good guys versus those that are just want to make money really quickly and, get out. How did you decide on that?
Yeah, so it's a really good point. So I'd say that past performance is probably the best predictor of future. What people will do. So I think you can look at track records of some of the venture firms and see, what they've done in the past. But I think it just took a lot of time and effort to meet with a number of folks, and sometimes you do the dance and it lasts a long time with nothing coming to fruition, and that was not uncommon. So it takes some perseverance, and I think it's often useful, even at early stages, to have those discussions with folks, even sometimes before the technology is ready, so that you have a clearer sense of what are the milestones that would need to be hit, and what kinds of things you need to do to make something commercially attractive.
Mm-hmm.
I should caution there, though, that sometimes in the industry, I've found that there's a groupthink within an industry. It's not always founded on strong science. And I'll just give you an example of this in our cardiac reprogramming work for converting fibroblasts to myocytes. We had shown a gene therapy approach working quite well some years before we started Tenaya. And at that time, I met probably with 4 or 5 different VC firms in the Bay Area, and they all told me the same thing, that this is really great, looks really nice, but we wouldn't touch gene therapy. So when you have a small molecule approach, come back and let us know, and we'd be eager. So yeah, we went back to the lab. We spent several years doing exactly that. Got pretty far with it, not maybe as all the way like we would wanted with that approach, and then came back a few years later and said, okay, here we are now. And sometimes from the same folks, I got this inquisitive look and said, why are you using small molecules? You can't control where they go. You should be doing this with gene therapy, because gene therapy had become really hot in the industry.
Yeah.
Valuations were crazy high for companies with successful gene therapies. And so the whole field had shifted very quickly within really a matter of 3 years. So
that consistent message, right, of persistence, right, seems to be coming through from all three. Very interesting. Yeah.
But speaking of shifted, I want to ask Carolyn some questions, because Carolyn's had the experience of working with founding a registry and doing it with a smaller company, MyoKardia, and then going through the experience of MyoKardia now being acquired by BMS. So maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, so it's really been a great partnership. It's been incredibly fruitful, and we're trying to figure out how to expand this a little more. And it was kind of a little bit of culture shock, I think, on both sides. Going from a very small kind of nimble company where we were no more than 2 people away from a decision to a huge company with like a vast team of lawyers, and then just got becoming ensnarled and all of that. I think just building upon some of the themes that have come up, trying to find the right industry partner, I think, is key. People that have the eye on the long game, and recognition of the importance of the knowledge to be gained, and and alignment about what knowledge is important. And so these partnerships have been really fruitful. We've been able to get NIH grants built on Share to fund the science, while industry is supporting the infrastructure. And again, we're eager to expand this model and get more industry partners engaged. So, I'd love to hear from Doug. What can you speak a little bit about what industry might be looking for with these partnerships? It's hard to have specific deliverables and milestones because it really is just trying to get a better window and more visibility into the natural history of these relatively rare conditions. That takes a bit of time.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm trying to, as you're saying that, I'm envisioning these things, even with LVH, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and these things. All these things translate to a company like Medtronic, right? We're treating these things, right? There's device therapies for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, so it sounds like something that should be a fit already. We do often fund our own registries. I guess I'll give another example for the area I'm in right now for renal denervation. Our clinical trials right now for this therapy are focused on lowering blood pressure. But the secondary question, maybe even a bigger question, is what can be done, for example, for outcomes, right? So in terms of cardiovascular risk and death and things like that, that's not where we're focused right now. And that's really kind of, even for a large company like Medtronic, it's almost beyond our scope. These could be trials of tens of thousands, and it could be very impractical. You could do, these modern, these approaches to running a registry where it's more practical, but it would still be very difficult. So, but one thing we're looking at is obtaining databases, or even looking at getting access to large registries where we could sort of project, or model the impact of our procedure and sort of get hints at what we could do to outcomes without actually running a prospective outcome trial. That's also an option. So I think all these things are very interesting. In fact, I was going to ask you back, what was in it for MyoKardia? How did MyoKardia, a startup company, get into something that sounds like a pretty big venture? But I'll finish my answer to your question in that I'll go back to perseverance. I don't think these things are off the table for us. I think the idea of establishing natural history registries is something that we'd be very interested in for a number of diseases, for a number of the multitude of disease states that a company like Medtronic is involved in. So I'll just go back to persistence. Whatever's working, whatever's not working, just give me a call.
Yeah, and I think that part, when we were first starting Share, part of that, there was a little bit of disbelief. It's like, what is in it for MyoKardia? It almost seems too good to be true. They're willing to sink a decent amount of money into establishing this. And I think that everybody just kind of took a leap of faith, and investigators, and that this would be the right partnership, that would be able to get along together, that would be able to pull it together, and MyoKardia, and that they would get something helpful in return. I think part of it was just establishing this big registry, which has been a big resource over time, and hopefully can help inform decisions for the company, or just provide more insight and visibility into some important issues about disease progression.
And this might be an aside, but I guess another point on this for partnering with a device company is remember, as a device company, just take your topic of LVH or any of the stuff. Dr. Srivastava, you were talking about regeneration and heart failure and these things and myocardium. With again, I'm not giving a plug here, but with implantable devices, with any implantable device, these devices also store data, right? So this is another source of data for your databases. With not just about devices like implantable loop recorders, but with pacemakers and implantable defibrillators and insulin pumps, we basically have patient level information. Now, this is all protected. We're all HIPAA compliant. This is all blinded data, but we do have access to data sets with data about the patients that's not in the clinical record that could be relevant to what you're doing. Knowing patient activity, knowing when they're having especially arrhythmia data, knowing when a patient's having a ventricular atrial arrhythmia. And I'm sure many patients in your database have implantable devices, probably not a majority, but probably in a big database, 10, 20%, or, just kicking out numbers. And that could also, help on both sides.
Yeah. So that's a great question, or great thing that you bring up, because we've been interested in a couple of years trying to figure out how we might be able to leverage, the big data that's stored by the device company. So about 20% of patients, 25% of patients in the U.S.
Yeah.
And about 10% of patients in the rest of the world have primary prevention ICDs for HCM.
Right.
And how can we partner with the device companies to try to get access to all that information to pair with the genotypic and phenotypic information we have and share to better understand what these events are and to better predict risk?
Yeah, I'm sitting here. I'm kind of frustrated. We should call somebody.
So is there a path ahead to try to
and I think yeah, and just to expand to the audience, I think these are things, I think what we're seeing here is the value of just having a conversation. I think what happens is just you hit these communication walls where everybody has a good idea that there is fertile territory for collaboration here, and for whatever reason it just doesn't happen. And it's not because the idea isn't right, and it's not because the interest isn't there, or the resources aren't there on both sides. I think what we're just seeing is again, getting back to what Deepak was saying earlier, sometimes it's just got to land on the right set of ears.
And be persistent, right? Because recognizing that these are, it's not like people have paved these paths before and that there's a clear-cut way of how to do it. So, here we hear a good idea and recognize that the first step is probably going to be lawyers on both sides that tell you this is not possible. And you have to just listen to that, but then push forward and say, no, let's figure out how this is possible. And that's where, again, I think, as academics, we're most familiar with working with our teams, our tech transfer teams, and our university lawyers. And, again, those are really important relationships to have. Those are the ones where they can really see your passion as an investigator, that you have an idea, that you think it's a good idea. And building those relationships, even from when you first start your career, is just really important to do. And if you don't have it now, it's never too late. Like, figure out who the person is and start the conversation. And then they realize when you do have an idea that's coming forward, a direct ask that you want from them, then you've already built some of that relationship already.
I just wanted.
Go ahead. No, please go ahead.
I just wanted to put out there for those that are kind of navigating the space that there are international certificate programs in the area of translational medicine. I personally was involved in it. It's called the Eureka Institute, and they initially expose you to a lot of this area early on, so that at least you're aware and it's on your radar of what to look for and the types of people to look for. It was started by someone in Italy, and they were more in the immunology world, but I know through Pat Furlong and PPMD, they've recruited people in the muscle sort of disease space to go to this conference in order to at least, as an early career investigator, you can sort of get exposed to, hey, if you have a finding, let's go through the avenues to how you can move this forward and what type of people you can connect with.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And what I was going to comment on is along the same lines, is that just my advice for people would be to find opportunities where you can develop a network over time and develop relationships even before you even really need them. So my experience is that the investors will often be most comfortable investing with people that they have come to know somehow, because they're investing almost as much in the person as they are in the idea. Because anybody with any experience in this industry knows that you might start with one idea. Over time, you will invariably face obstacles. Sometimes you can cross those and other times you can't, but you can do something else interesting together. And so I think people with experience are really considering the person as much as the science. And so the more time you've built with individuals, they get to know you and trust you and as a person and with your scientific instincts, I think you're more likely to develop that partnership.
And I just want to put a plug in. Hopefully people understand, like, this is worth spending time on. I mean, I think most of us really enjoy seeing the translational aspects of our work go forward. It's incredibly gratifying to watch this happen. I mean, you do all this work in the lab and make all these discoveries, but there's an element of taking those discoveries and trying to move it towards becoming a therapeutic or becoming a therapeutic for a patient that, again, is really gratifying. I mean, I run a big research lab, as do a number of people on this call, but my trainees really enjoy it also. Like, I expose them to all parts of it. They get experience. I've had a number that go off into industry probably because they've had that exposure and they've seen the things that can happen. One of my trainees is actually the go-to patent lawyer now, former trainee, I should say, is now our go-to patent lawyer for both the University of Chicago and Northwestern University. And it's just great to be able to reach out to him and talk to him about different ideas and know he has the tremendous background in science that he has. So there's a lot of learning that comes with this. It's really exciting stuff. And, it just exposes you to a side of your research that you might not be thinking of otherwise.
And we're in a better position than anybody else as our ideas go forward to continue it, to keep the focus on the mission, which is ultimately to help the people that are suffering from the diseases that we're researching and trying to understand the basis for. There's no better advocate than us, and of course the patients themselves, for that, so that there's a clear eye on the ball. What is it we're trying to do and why? And I think that's really important, because that's not always the case with the folks that are trying to commercialize it.
And that voice is really helpful in the process when you're sitting in the room with people and you're able to refer to that and say, look, this is the disease process. This is what we want to fix. It's really helpful for people in the industry side to hear that. So.
Carolyn, I was curious, just any pitfalls that you've particularly gone through, because you've had such a successful transition with MyoKardia to BMS, and, that you can speak to that, oh, I wish I wouldn't have done that, or I wish it would have gone a different way.
Well, lots of lessons learned from, trying to get this thing started, and, how I would do it differently. In the future, just in terms of structuring, data capture and all of that. I think that the process of transitioning from Myo to BMS is still in progress. So we're learning a lot, again, about the difference between small startups and big companies, and hopefully, trying to smooth out all the various moving pieces.
Anything you would do differently in the future from what you've learned, and how that could be done, that could be better?
I think the main thing is, initially we started off, in kind of a friends and family approach, just trying to get started. And so we didn't want to rock the boat too much. We definitely didn't want to create work for people, because bandwidth is pretty scarce. So we start off by just saying, okay, everybody, continue to collect data the way you've been collecting data. We'll give you a person to help fill in the data. And then we'll just, we'll do the work on the back end by, harmonizing and centralizing. And then it took, ugly meetings over several years to, kind of, try to define everything and, what does no really mean, what is missing really mean. And, we just probably should have started with, developing a robust, common data capture platform that we rolled out in the beginning. And so we're doing that now. So, I, probably, would have tried to do that earlier in the game if possible. And then, if we had the ability to try to bank samples early in the game, because, the earlier you start collecting samples, the earlier you get, be able to collect, a viable amount. And, the earlier you start the clock in terms of like when, the baseline is and, what happens from then on to really understand what your biomarkers are predicting. So I think, trying to do that, set that up as early as possible would also be helpful in the future.
What it's worth, Carolyn, we'd say all the same things about the neuromuscular disease registries. I mean, this is rare diseases, right? You're coming up with new endpoints and how to think about it. And all that's critically important because ultimately it's informing your clinical trials, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and then just trying to, we took a very broad approach to it, rather than, forcing everybody to use a case report form. We really wanted to just like holistically gather, all sorts of information that you obtain during clinical encounters. So we could really not be limited to like a certain question at a certain time, but be able to like ask, all sorts of questions over time because we've had enough data captured.
I think we're at the end of our time. And I just want to thank all the panelists for joining us, and hopefully people got to learn some good things, and we look forward to all the great science and invention people will have going forward, and that's how we get to new treatments. So
Thank you all. Thank you guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
bye-bye.